Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleague, good morning and a very warm welcome from me, Hannah Neumann, member of the European Parliament, and my colleague Alviina Alametsä to our meeting today, How to Prevent EU Arms from Fueling Conflict Elsewhere. This is the topic of our discussion today, and I think it comes in very timely in a moment where we are seeing a lot of discussion on the European level, but also in EU member states about a European Defence Union and about working closer together in the defense sector. I welcome you very warmly from Iraq. Just in case you're wondering about my background, I was on an election observation mission in Baghdad. And as this morning, the Iranian-backed PMF militia have declared they are not going to accept the result of this technically very solid election mission. So let's see what will happen today. Also bear with me if I have some technical difficulties, but as of now, the stream is running fine. We are kind of witnessing firsthand here of what it means if we see a diversion of weapons and they end up in the hands of non-state actors. That brings us right into the topic of today's discussion. The EU wants to be, and in many cases is, a responsible actor in this world in chaos, and that's why we strongly believe that the EU companies and the European Union member states should not make money with the suffering of people around the world by exporting weapons that fuel conflict or that are used to commit grave human rights violations. And how can we better prevent this from happening? That's exactly the topic of our today's discussion. And I'm very happy that we have him with us, Andrew Feinstein, Roy Isbister, Marjolijn van Deelen, and as a moderator, Teri Schultz, and she will present all of these very distinguished guests to you in a second. What we have done, and we have worked on this issue in the last 2 years, including my report in the European Parliament and preparing our proposal today for how EU arms export control could be, brought to the next step. And we have talked to a number of citizens around the European Union to see how they perceive EU arms exports and where they would like or not like to see EU arms being exported to. And maybe that's where we can start with a short presentation of a poll, an opinion poll that we did in all EU member states on the issue of arms exports. And I think, yeah, that's brilliant. Magically, it appears on the screen. I like this tool. We asked citizens in all EU member states, what do you think about arms exports? What do you think about arms exports to countries that are involved in war or armed conflict? I was aware of such kind of opinion polling for the case of Germany, where we have a big public resistance against this kind of arms exports. But it was very interesting for me and us to see, and you're the first ones to see that public, how across the European Union, people in other EU member states perceive this. And what you can see looking at the screen, where the green bar clearly saying we are against such exports. So EU countries should not export arms to war regions or to situations of armed conflicts, and the pink one saying the EU should. You could see across EU member states a, for me, rather surprising consistency that EU citizens are against these kind of exports. On an EU average is 72%. So that's nearly 3/4 of the people. We asked them the same question with regards to another issue when it comes to arms exports, that is exports to countries that commit human rights abuses. And can we just have the next slide, please? Here you see the results for that one. So do you think EU countries should or should not sell military weapons to countries that do not have a good record on human rights? And here we see the picture is even more consistent and more clear, with an EU average of nearly 80%, so 79% of EU citizens do not want to see this kind of arms exports. And those of you who are a bit familiar with the issue of arms exports, if you look at the case of France, it's only about 12% of people who actually are fine or acceptable to the kind of arms exports that are often happening. The same if you look to other member states that export to sometimes critical situations. So we have a situation where our EU citizens are clearly against these arms exports, and we ask them, who should actually make decision on arms exports? And here we can have the next slide. Again, for those of you who are experts in the issue of arms export, at the moment, it's national member states that are making decisions on arms exports. But if we ask the citizens of who should be in charge of setting the rules that a country in the US to follow when selling weapons to other countries, they would say across the board the European Union. So on average, I think it's 50%, so half of EU citizens that say it should be the European Union. Then it's another, well, rather consistent group of 20 or a bit more percent that say it should even be an international organization. And it's only the minority that would say it's the national level that should do these decisions. So that's the opinion poll we made because we wanted, before we start to engage in this discussion, also have a better understanding of what European citizens want. What is very interesting to know as a backdrop that the European Union member states have a common agreement on where arms export should happen and not should happen. They have all signed the Arms Trade Treaty. They have all signed and just recently reevaluated the common position of EU member states. And these positions, these treaties reflect what EU citizens want to see. In the common position, we have the 8 criteria where, for example, arms export should not happen where they could fuel a crisis or armed conflict, where they could be misused for human rights violations and the like. So we have citizens that do not want this kind of arms export, and especially that want to have a proper debate about them. We do have an international treaty and EU rules that are against this kind of arms exports. But if we look at the actual exports happening, the situation is rather bleak. I think last week, the European Union External Action Service and COARMS, so the Council Working Group on Arms Exports, reported on the arms exports for 2020 and the issuance license. And there we saw that 14 billion arms exports for 40 billion were licensed for United Arab Emirates, arms exports for 10 billion to Saudi Arabia, both involved in the war in Yemen, and 8 billion to Egypt, a country that does not have a very positive human rights record, to put it in mild terms. So we see that despite these rules and citizens' opinion, the Middle Eastern region is actually the biggest arms importer from EU member states. We also see that often these weapons, especially when they are diverted, so the proper end user is not using them, but they are handed on, for example, to terrorist groups, to militia, maybe just because they were left there after a war, as we have seen now with US weapons coming in the hand of Taliban. But we also saw that with German weapons, for example, in the hands of ISIS, that these weapons also provoke displacement, directly provoke displacement, provoke refugees that then need to leave their home countries. And in some cases, and for me, that's one of the most paradoxical cases, and we even see that arms produced in the EU are used to fight against each other, a situation that we at one point were afraid to even see between Greece using arms produced in the EU because they are in the European Union member state, and Turkey having German submarines that may be used against Greece. And these are exactly the kind of situations that are fueling wars in the world. But because of the different decisions of EU member states, some exporting to Saudi Arabia, for example, and others not, they are also clearly undermining a common foreign and security policy of the European Union. And because of the debates between member states when they have very different export decisions, also create a lot of conflict between member states and clearly hamper the development of joint arms system, but also the idea of a European Defence Union and a strategic autonomy. What we see at the moment on the political level in the European Union is there is a strong push towards more cooperation and collaboration in the defence sector. We've seen with the European Defence Fund, especially the European Union as an own actor getting involved in research and development in the arms industry. We saw in the last State of the Union address from Ursula von der Leyen another push towards closer cooperation in the defense area, with discussion about value-added tax exemption for the arms industry and the announcement of a big defense summit early next year under the French presidency. And there's one missing link in all of these discussions. While we are discussing how the arms industry can work together and how also the European Union can support the defense industry, So far, the elephant in the room has been the issue of arms export. Because if we work together in arms production, well, we need to work together when it comes to export decisions, because as of now, it's nearly impossible for a product to say it's a French one or it's a German one, because it has components from all member states, and that's exactly what we want to even increase. So what we as Greens are saying and proposing today is that if we work together on the issue of arms production, we also need to discuss the other side of the coin, and that is export control. And yes, one that is in line with our international commitments in the Arms Trade and Treaty, and yes, one that is more transparent and publicly accountable. And that stems behind our proposal that we are going to present today. And maybe, Jerome, I could just have the next slide of the presentation, so you also have a bit of a visual overview. We as Greens drafted a regulation on arms export that has the intention to transfer what we have in the common position, on which all member states agreed, into an EU regulation, so to make it really legally enforceable. What we propose today, we don't think it's the end of the discussion, but we very much think it has to be the start of a European discussion about arms exports. What did we do? In 2020, there have been 13,000 licenses issued by EU member states. Our draft regulation does not intend to put all these license decisions on the EU level. We clearly say the licensing procedure can remain on national level. National authorities, in the way they do it, should take care of it. But we need to have a common standard and common risk assessment when it comes to the export of countries where they could be problematic according to our own rules in the common position. So what we suggest is we move the issue of arms exports to the common commercial policy, because arms export, as the word says, is export. Export is commercial policy is EU authority. We are doing the same that has been done many years ago with the dual-use goods. There is an EU dual-use regulation. What has been done with the firearms? There is a firearms regulation. So other aspects of arms and weapons have already been transferred to the common commercial policy. And we just suggest, let's use this final part of arms, those that are under the military list categories, and just organize them in the very same way that everything else is organized already. So we move the issue of arms export, basically the common position, into the common commercial policy, but allowing member states, based on their national security interests, to sometimes deviate from that joint position. How that's going to work, I will explain to you in a second. We want to create a few new bodies at EU level to increase the convergence towards a stricter arms export policy. So we clearly say, if we want to work towards a European Defence Union, towards strategic autonomy, have a joint defence culture, build a joint defence culture, we need to also do a joint risk assessment at EU level for tricky arms export destinations, rather than 27 very different and sometimes even undermining each other ones. So that's the first one. We want to build a common risk assessment body. That's also something I'm going to explain in depth in a second. That produces a list of countries to which exports could be problematic according to the common position, and then does a very detailed risk assessment on each and every one of that one. And we want to introduce an EU level end user control. Every license comes with an end user certificate. Some member states have slowly started to build up some bodies or institutions that do end user control. It's very painful. It only works so far for the big ones. So we say, why do we have to build that up 27 times? Let's just do it together. This approach that we suggest will increase transparency. It will increase transparency because we want to build an open source intelligence unit in parallel to the common risk assessment body, where civil society, especially those working with open source intelligence, and there's so much knowledge out there, can feed in a very formalized way all their input into it, and it has to be taken into account by the common risk assessment body and the EU decision making, as well as the member states. And we want to, not even stricter annual reporting obligations. In the end, we just want to enforce the obligations that are there in the common position. If we manage to do that, we will increase accountability. because we will finally make the EU common position legally enforceable. At the moment, it says it's legally binding, but there's just no court you can take someone to. And we have seen that in the past. It was very frustrating for some member states, but also for civil society organizations to see that if companies or countries undermine our common rules, there's just nothing they could do. That will change with our EU regulation because it will provide legal avenues to the European Court of Justice. And as a slight note, if we already start doing things, we do them right. We also want to improve a bit the 8 criteria of the common position. First, the criterion of gender-based violence that is in the Arms Trade Treaty has not been brought into the common position so far. So that's something we want to do, to reintroduce, as well as the criterion of corruption as one that has to become part of the common risk assessment, because corruption is something that is very problematic, especially when it comes to diversion of arms. So we are not doing something new and something crazy. I want to be very clear about that. We are just taking the common position, so the rules on which we have all agreed upon, all member states have, and put them into something that's legally enforceable, and that makes sure that we have, or we work towards an EU agreement on where we export arms and where we don't, rather than member states making all their own decisions, creating a lot of conflict between member states and undermining an EU foreign policy. What does it look like in a bit of more detail? And then in the end, you can download the whole regulation, which is like 40 pages or 5 pages explainer. But I'm going to just briefly explain 2 things to you. Can we have the next slide, please? The common risk assessment body, because that is kind of the core of what is new in our regulation. We want to build a common risk assessment body of independent, and that's important, independent experts. So think of it like an ethics body. We want to bring in experts from different backgrounds, from different EU member states, women, men, into this body with an expertise. They have an expertise on either regional or the issue of arms exports. And we want them to take the rules of the common position, to look at them and check which countries, exports to which countries could be problematic according to the common position, draw a list of countries that would then be endorsed by Parliament and the Commission, and then do a detailed risk assessment for each of these countries. And we would then assume that member states, when they want to export to one of these countries, they check the risk assessment and only export if it's in line with the risk assessment. So that's where we build a joint detailed risk assessment. The beauty of it, at the moment, it's often the same people that violate our EU rules who are, or it's the same people that benefit from an export that actually make the export decisions. In France, for example, the state and the arms industry is the same. In other countries, they are at least closely linked, and we want to decouple that. And we want to build in an avenue for exchange for the civil society, which is the open source intelligence unit, because their assessments need to be taken into account by the common risk assessment body. So what, and that will be the last slide, what that would an actual export licensing procedure look like? We introduced one slide, additional modification that's quite common in EU commercial policy, which is the due diligence. So we expect an exporter, before he exports, to do a due diligence check, and so whether their exports would be in line with the rules of the common position. If an exporter thinks that's fine, so an arms company, they request a license with the National Export Authority, which is pretty much what they do right now already. The licensing authority would do 2 things. It would do a national assessment based on their national criteria, which remain valid, and it would do a check against the EU assessment produced by the joint assessment body. If the national assessment is stricter than the assessment of the EU assessment body, they can very well walk with the national assessment and even forbid or deny an arms export, even though it will be fine according to the EU assessment. If the EU assessment is stricter or the only one available, we assume they would go in line with the joint EU assessment, because we want to build a European Defence Union, and then make that decision. That's the normal licensing procedure. It's quite clear, it's quite straightforward. It only gets a bit more complicated if a member state, for whatever reason, wants to move away from the EU decision making. Can we just have a click on that slide, and then I think we should see the second part of it. So if an EU member state does a national assessment and says we want for our own security interests to export despite a contradictory statement of the EU assessment body. They will have to justify the export. So they will have to write a written statement why it's in their national security interests. That would be shared with the joint risk assessment body. It would be shared with the working group of Council and Commission on Arms Export, and it would be shared with the European Parliament, where it can also be publicly debated. And in case of, let's say, constant violations, the working group can introduce sanctions or take some decisions, challenge some decisions in front of the European Court of Justice. That is our proposal. That's how we want to start the debate. And now I would be very happy to hear some input from our distinguished guests, as well as you in the live stream. And let's see how far we can take that. I think it's really the missing side of the coin of what we're discussing at the moment when it comes to the European Defence Union.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was very interesting. I've got a page of questions here, so I hope our audience will also join in and contribute them in their chat along the right-hand side of their screen. Let me introduce our expert panelists, because I also am very eager to hear their views on this. I think all of us have been, or I presume all of us have been disturbed, for example, in the most recent cases, Hannah, as you mentioned, of seeing the Taliban brandishing their U.S. weapons and selling them for high prices in the markets. I think that if we needed a reminder of how dangerous this can be, we've certainly had them in recent days. So let's move on to the real experts here. Andrew Feinstein is the executive director of Shadow World Investigations. He is also the author of The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. His nonprofit researches the global arms trade. And for this work, Andrew was named as one of the 100 most influential people in the world working against armed violence. He was also a member of Parliament in South Africa, where he served under Nelson Mandela. Roy Isbister leads Saferworld's work on conventional arms. He has some 20 years' experience in developing and implementing strategies to promote the adoption of responsible arms transfer control strategies nationally, regionally, and internationally. Marjolijn van Deelen assumed the position of EU Special Envoy for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament on the 1st of September last year. She's a Dutch career diplomat, and before joining the EU External Action Service, the EEAS, she headed the Non-Proliferation, Disarmament, and Nuclear Affairs Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. So thank you very much to all three of you for being here and being willing to weigh in on the proposal and help us discuss whether we think it can be adopted and how quickly. So again, audience, you can go ahead and submit your questions now. You can also tweet about our event at #EUArms. So we're going to now start with Andrew. Now, Andrew, given your expertise in the global arms trade, and particularly in the lack of transparency about the global arms trade, I'm really interested in hearing how you respond to the proposal of the Greens. And what would be, given the suggestions that Hannah has laid out for us here, what do you think would be the first and most urgent priority that the EU should make if they were going to really attack this lack of transparency and the proliferation of weapons to places they supposedly don't want them to be? Andrew.
Thanks so much, Teri. And first of all, may I just say thank you for the invitation. It really is a delight to be with this great panel today and with Hannah and yourself. I think that this proposal is an extremely good one. It is probably the most substantive and the most meaningful proposal that I've seen from any political group, probably anywhere in the world. And I think it comes at a time, as Hannah said, when we have seen a complete corrosion in trust about whether arms export controls are meaningful, because we have a situation in the countries of the European Union and the United Kingdom where selling weapons into the conflict in Yemen is, to my mind, quite clearly a violation of those countries' national laws and also of the EU common position. But it seems to me that there are few, if any, consequences for that. Now, in terms of the priorities, I think every element of the proposal has great merit. I think particularly the additional criteria proposed are extremely important, that around gender-based violence, because unfortunately, as we know from a variety of research, it is primarily women, and primarily women in poorer countries, who really suffer the worst consequences of what I believe is an under-regulated and at times out of control global trade in weapons. But I would like to focus for a moment, if I may, Teri, on the corruption aspect. The reality is that corruption in the global arms trade accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all global trade, which is an extraordinary amount. And the reason for that is because those making the decisions in both the buying and the selling countries are the very same people who benefit both politically and materially from those arms sales. So why do I say that? Well, because of the veil or curtain of national security imposed secrecy that surrounds everything that happens in the global arms trade, it is not only those in the buying countries who receive incentives, often in the forms of bribes or other benefits in kind, but some of those bribes return to the selling country, to senior executives of the defense companies, sometimes to politicians individually, often to political parties of the governments that are allowing those arms sales. And I mean, as the UK and many other defense and national security reviews have found, corruption actually undermines our national security. But this is almost ironic, given that the arms trade is such a profound contributor to corruption in the world. And I suppose it's worth saying that the other reason why this corruption is so profound in this particular industry is because of the incredibly close relationships between the producers of the weapons and between those who have to make the decisions about where the weapons can and can't be exported to. With respect to the proposal that has been made by the Greens, which, as I say, I think is an incredibly important one, I would add in relation to corruption that the various bodies that are established would have to have the capacity to look into the role of intermediaries, the so-called middlemen, the dealers, brokers, agents, the law firms, financial institutions, consultants, who act as intermediaries in these deals and who are often the site of much of the corruption that takes place. So that's certainly the one addition that I would strongly recommend. But why this focus on corruption? Well, first of all, we see many examples of arms deals where military equipment is bought not because it's the best equipment to keep the citizens of a country safe, but because it's the equipment on which the biggest bribes are paid. And I experienced that in my own political career in South Africa, where, as you mentioned, I was an ANC member of parliament, where my own government decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that we had absolutely no need for, most of which haven't been used today. And the only real reason for those is that $350 million of bribes were paid by companies from Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, almost all of them through intermediaries of various sorts. Now, this had the impact not only of corroding South Africa's very young democracy at this point, but also setting back our economic and socio-economic development that is so important to stability in a country in transition as we were at the time. And in case there is anybody out there who thinks that perhaps corruption is a victimless crime, let me tell you just what happened on the South African arms deal. At the time that we were spending this $10 billion on weapons that we didn't need and barely use, our then president was telling the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS that we couldn't afford to provide them with antiretroviral medication to keep them alive. As a consequence, a study at Harvard University concluded conservatively that over the next 5 years, 365,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths. 32,000 babies a year, every year for 5 years, were born HIV positive. because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment, but we could afford to spend $10 billion on weapons. So this gives you perhaps a slightly different perspective on the impacts of corruption on the global arms trade. So in conclusion, let me say this is a very important proposal. We will get a sense by the reaction to this proposal whether there is real and meaningful political will on the part of European leaders to better reflect the views of European citizens expressed in those surveys that Hannah showed us. And if we don't do this, the reality is the EU will be a less safe place for all its citizens.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And that leads perfectly into what I was going to address to Roy right here at the beginning. You must have, as a representative of civil society, of NGO, been very heartened to see the result of that survey that Hannah showed us, at how many people, when asked the question, do not want their governments to be selling arms to countries that don't have good human rights records or have even a murky plan for what to do with these weapons. So, Roy, if I could ask you, what do you think that civil society can do now to change the situation, to support a proposal like the one that we've just heard about?
Thank you, Teri. And yes, I would agree with a lot of what has been represented here, and I agree with a lot of what is in I think the proposal is very strong, and there's a lot in there which is extremely positive, I think. And I would, in terms of the role of civil society, is clearly what the role of society or civil society always is, which is to engage fully in these debates, to increase public awareness about them, because what we saw in the poll was not surprising to me. Most people are pretty horrified to think that we would be selling weapons that are going to be used to abuse human rights, that would be used in effectively illegitimate conflicts. So there's no surprise there, but it's about public awareness, spreading the word of what's possible, getting the more and more people who can raise this as an issue in a political space, then the more we get listened to, and that's kind of quite self-evident. And clearly, what we have, there's a need for this to happen in this situation at the moment, because the situation is not working, or the current regime isn't functioning as it's intended. It's delivery in two ways, if you like. It's delivering bad decisions, and those have been mentioned, especially in the context of the Yemen war, which is probably the most obvious example of where this has all gone wrong. But also the idea is that that there should be convergence across the EU, and there clearly isn't convergence across the EU, because in the case of the Yemen war, you've got some who are selling everything they can into that context, and you've got others who have effectively put in place what is effectively de facto embargo. So there's wildly divergent views across the EU, which is not the way that the system's designed to work. And clearly, what we've seen, the proposal that we've seen, is taking that on head on, and I think it's very welcome to see that. But we need to keep in mind that a more centralized system, and acknowledging that there's this relationship between the member states and the central institutions is complicated here in the proposal. But if centralizing decision making can very easily lead to bad decision making made at a central point. So the way, it's not just a case of moving more power, if you like, into the center, but it's thinking about how that happens. And I think there's a lot in the proposal that is clearly engaging in that, which is very important. I think what we need you need mechanisms that prevent bad decision making, and building robust, strong additional mechanisms is going to be critical. Now, the proposal, as I see it, it starts from the basis that the criteria-based system that exists at the moment is okay, and there should be a case-by-case licensing decision-making process, because that's the way the system works, and that doesn't seem to be challenged here. And I basically agree with that, though I think there are some additional things you could bring on top of case-by-case licensing, which maybe we could get into in the Q&A. It also is the assumption that transparency and accountability currently are inadequate, which I would completely agree with. So I'm glad to see the steps that are being proposed to improve that. And if I suppose where it gets tricky, if you like, is this relationship between this proposed common risk assessment body, which I really like the name. It's a great acronym, CRAB. So whoever came up with that, well done. But what is the relationship between the CRAB and the member states? And this idea that the way the CRAB seems to work, well, actually, just maybe one thing on the CRAB first, or a couple of things on the CRAB first. Staffing, Hannah went into this to some level, but the staffing is absolutely critical of this in terms of its size. It's got to be big enough. So it's got to have enough resources, the diversity of expertise, the quality of expertise, and the independence is so critical, because there will be huge external pressure, as there is now, to influence the makeup of that body and the decisions that it takes. So big questions to be asked about how that independence is guaranteed, how staff are protected from, how the body and its staff are protected from that external influence. And also, just as an aside, I'm a big fan of the open source intelligence unit. I think that's an excellent idea. Yeah, again, questions around exactly how that would work, but I think it's an excellent addition. But the key issue, as I said, is how does the EU and the member states intersect? Because as I read the proposal, the CRAB is making decisions at a country level and then broken down to a certain extent at military list level. So it's giving an overall assessment of a country, but then also looking at what that means for particular types of equipment. But if we have a case-by-case licensing system, that there are a lot of variables that operate underneath that on the specific recipient within a country, the specific types of equipment, and there's a lot of variation within different military list categories. The quantities make a difference. Are there any steps that are already in place between the potential supplying state and the recipient state about how trying to address potential problems? Now, in simple cases, this will be no problem, or at least it shouldn't be. And for example, selling arms that might end up in the Yemen war, being used in the Yemen war, those just shouldn't be happening, but they are. But there are cases at the margin. There are always going to be cases at the margin, given this is about assessing risk, where two different people of good faith could come up with different decisions. So how is that kind of going to be managed in the relationship between these two bodies? And I think I just think there needs to be more. That needs to be more explanation, more elaboration, and more of a conversation about how that is going to happen. I suppose one other thing that has me slightly concerned, maybe just to finish, would be the circumstances where the European level body, the CRAB, has said that it is acceptable to export. The space is given for the member state to continue to refuse in spite of a prior approval, if you like, by the CRAB. But I think the likelihood in those circumstances of the member state refusing the transfer kind of on top of that prior approval is I don't think it's going to happen very often, and that's because there's going to be huge pressures within country from defence industry and other parts of the body politic to say that you are disadvantaging us against our competitors and partners in the EU, when the EU itself has said that this is okay. So I think that's another side that needs to be thought about a bit more. But those are kind of down in the details, but I think at a conceptual level, I think this is a great start for that conversation, and I'm really looking forward to being part of that conversation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Roy. Some good points that I'm sure Hannah can clarify, or Marjolijn, who will be speaking now. Now, with your long career working on EU disarmament issues and non-proliferation issues, we have a system already, Marjolijn. Is it working in your view? I mean, if everyone agreed that it was, we would not have this new proposal to strengthen the criteria and the oversight. So I'm very interested to hear from you from inside the European Union, inside the EEAS structures. Do you think it's broken, the system as it exists now, and do we need this proposal?
Well, thanks very much, Teri, for that question. And I also wanted to thank Member of Parliament Neumann for inviting me. I'm really thankful for the proposals that you've made that are very well thought through and prepared. So joining others in giving compliments for that. And I also think it's really important to keep feeding the public debate on EU arms exports. Because as you know, arms export is still a clear member state competence based on the EU legally binding framework provided by our common position of 2008. But it's certainly important to keep discussing on these very important matters. Arms export control decisions receive great attention and they're politically very sensitive, because indeed there is a potential risk of breaches of human rights, of humanitarian law, of regional stability. So it's very important to keep discussing and to keep trying to improve our system. Of course, military weapons have an indispensable role in the preservation of security, freedom, and peace, provided that they're used in accordance with international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law. At the same time, of course, weapons of war are capable of inflicting death and destruction. And these two sides mean that governments must make sure that they export their weapons in a very responsible and accountable way, and prevent the diversion to terrorists and criminals and other unauthorized users. And this is still very much our ambition level within the EU. So a strict implementation by member states of the common position that we currently have on arms exports is essential to uphold these values and strategic objectives. It's crucial for our credibility, and a higher level of convergence regards to the full application will indeed more effectively ensure respect for human rights and international law by all parties involved. So currently the EU is moving very fast in the field of defense. We have developments such as the European Defense Fund and the European Peace Facility that are serving to strengthen internal collaboration on defense matters, to make the EU a more capable security provider at the global level. The defense industries in the EU will become even closer intertwined because of this, and this will help strengthen our strategic autonomy. This will help protect EU citizens, and it will also foster innovation, and it will save costs. At the same time, in this context, further convergence of arms exports become even more important if we have a stronger industry. And of course, the defense industry is different from other industrial sectors, and it deserves a special consideration, taking into account the very obvious links to national and international security and human rights and humanitarian values. So that is exactly why we have this common position since 2008, where member states need to deny an export license if there is a clear risk that the military technology or equipment to be exported might be used for internal repression, or the commission of serious violations of international humanitarian law, so the 8 criteria. And these 8 criteria are assessed on a case-by-case basis. So depending on the country, but also depending on the type of arms and its purpose. And I think that's an important remark listening to the previous discussions. To have one risk assessment per country is probably not granular enough to really decide on export licenses. If you take one example, marine patrol ships, could those one might think you could export those to a country that has issues with internal repression, because ships are very unlikely to be used for internal repression, but they might be very useful in combating drug trafficking or terrorism. So you'd really need to look at what type of equipment and how it's going to be used before you can actually take an informed decision. And I see there a little bit of a risk in risk assessment just based on a country, which will have a lot of different aspects. But in the EU, we have the COARM, our Council Working Group, that's tasked with the implementation of the common position. That works well. It's a place where we exchange information on licenses, also on denials, where member states decide not to issue a license. Other states are obliged then not to undercut that decision and to issue a license for something that's very similar. We have moved on transparency quite a bit, but happy to talk about that later. With our database, the EU is one of the most transparent set of countries in the world. We've moved on end user certificates, which is a complicated matter already mentioned before. And we're currently working on a database for licensing officers based on open source information. I see you're back on the screen, Teri, and that's, I'm sure, a gentle reminder for me to wrap up. I'm happy to go into further questions.
Just follow up on my original question. Do you feel then, and I didn't hear otherwise in your remarks there, that the system as it stands now is good enough, that it's working, that you're satisfied with it being the envoy for non-proliferation and disarmament, or do you believe this proposal is needed?
I think we should always keep on working on improving the system that we have. And as I mentioned, we keep taking steps as were proposed by our revision of a couple of years ago to increase further convergence. And it's very interesting to see that many of the things that we are currently working on are also included in the proposal that is now on the table. For example, the database for licensing officers. We're currently working on a set of open data information per country, which would be reports from well-known human rights organizations, assessments by our member states, information of past exports and what's happened to those end user certificates, so that member states would have the same information base to take their decisions on. That is one step away from having a joint risk assessment. But as I said, that can be tricky because it would need to be both country-wise and per type of weapon system, so that would be very big. But we are moving in that direction already. So a lot of very big similarities of what we are working on.
Okay, I'll let the authors of the proposal come back on that again if they would like. Alviina, I'm going to bring you in here, and just to our audience, we have about 75 people watching right now. Remember to send your questions in as well. I feel so lucky to have so many experts here on this very tantalizing proposal about strengthening arms control and non-proliferation. So we want to very much share the stage. Alviina, remarks on what we've heard so far?
Yes, thank you so much, Teri. Thank you all. It has been such a pleasure to see all of this interest towards our proposal, and thank you, Hannah, as well. And yes, all the audience, whatever questions you might have for us, feel free. I just wondered if I could ask a bit more specifically from Marjolijn. As the chair of the EU Working Party on Conventional Arms Exports, I wonder if you would be able to shed a light on how does the COARM see currently the development of arms export regime, and if it considers that there is a particular issues that would be then improved. Thank you so much.
Yes, of course. Of course, the COARM also has a dedicated chair that does the day-to-day or the month-by-month chairing of that group. I don't do that personally. But COARM indeed has been working quite a lot on further convergence of arms exports. But at the same time, it's also very clear to our member states that they are attached to the fact that this is the decision is a member state competence. So we share information. We are very transparent about our decisions. We discuss a lot internally sensitive destinations. And these are very important to ensure that authorities understand each other's motives and reasoning. So I also mentioned denials. We have a closed and online system that enables further exchange between member states and export control authorities. And that really helped even when in-person meetings were impossible because of the pandemic. Because a lot of this information is very sensitive. So it is very important that member states have a safe space to exchange this information.
Hannah, I think you want to come in now and talk a bit about member states' competence. So that's a perfect transition to you.
Yes, I absolutely would like to, because Marjolijn, I think, did a brilliant job in describing the COARM system. Our assessment, I have to say, is it doesn't work. And it's not that it doesn't work because people in COARM are not doing their job well, but because the system increasingly reaches its borders. Maybe let's start with the issue of convergence. Marjolijn clearly explained that member states, once they deny an export, they report that internally. What we see, however, is in many cases that if one member state denies an export, it's not the others just following in with that denial, but picking up their phones and calling that country and saying, okay, country A doesn't export, but we can send it to you. So it's a perversion really of the convergence idea that we see in the competition of the defense industry at the moment. And the second issue that we see is this whole idea, and we are challenging legally that the whole legal authorities with member states to do the business. I think we really need to get away with that narrative, because legally it's not true. There has been the common position, but then we had the Lisbon Treaty. So there is an EU umbrella over all of these decisions. And even Article 346, which is what member states refer to, say there can only be exemptions based on national security interests. Not everything can be based on national security interests. And they cannot undermine EU rules for 100%, which is some export decisions like sending arms to Sisi, irrelevant of this human rights record, clearly do. So we have a legal battle on whether it's member states' authority or not. We have the issue on convergence, where some member states really undermine to a degree that I find unbearable the notion of convergence and COARM. And that is the more we work together on arms production. I mean, who makes a national decision? If we have the future combat air system that we want to build now with France, Spain, and Germany, who makes the export decision? Whom of the three, if it's national authority? It doesn't make sense. What do we do with EDF-funded project? It's EU money in it. Who makes the decision? Well, it has to be the EU. And that's why we will need to build up the system. And that's exactly the idea. Rather than having a COARM where they consult and then everyone does whatever they want to, we have a joint EU risk assessment, and that's what we expect member states to comply with, except for very singular, peculiar national security decisions. And that's a European approach. And if we build a European defense union, we need a European approach to exports. because otherwise we'll just be running in circles.
Yeah, indeed. As I said, the EDF has very much increased the need for convergence, and we are in the process of discussing in COARM how to deal with this. I wouldn't.
Well, we
want
have
to
a suggestion for you there.
Sorry?
Discuss that one. We have a suggestion for how to deal with it.
Yes, and I think it's very good, and I think it will need to be discussed with our member states. That you put it on the table, and I think it has there's a lot of elements that are very interesting and that have a lot of merit. I just can't right now say how our member states are going to feel about that. That's not my place. I just think it's important, it's relevant, and we need to discuss it. But there can also be angles where member states might have a different view. And that legal debate, that's a really complex one. Member states still insist on their national competence on these decisions. So we need to find ways, especially for EDF. Indeed, as you say, well, multiple countries will have worked on equipment or on materials that might get exported. This will take a while. Who then takes that decision, or how do we do that jointly? Or as you suggest, that this to be supranational, done in a supranational way, but it could also be done in a different way. So that we'll keep discussing, and it's really good to take all these suggestions on board. But I see you pushing, but I cannot say right here and now that they will all be accepted by our member states.
Okay, I'm going to let Marjolijn take a breather for just a moment now and come back to our other panelists. Andrew, we're talking now about possibly reducing, I mean, in the view of this proposal, reducing the arms exports. So what incentive would the producers have to support this, or even for member state governments to support losing this money from their GDP?
Well, I think there are two key responses to that. The first is the incentives provided to producers exist now. This is probably the most subsidized industry and economic sector on the planet in terms of government subsidy. In terms of its contribution to our economies, again, there are a lot of misconceptions.
But these are incentives to produce. These are incentives to produce, not necessarily to comply with, the human rights standards or
I would argue very strongly. I have a slightly different view. I would say that there are all sorts of incentives to produce now. What we actually need, so we've got the carrots. What we actually need now are some sticks. And I think the key stick would be far greater transparency, but also, as Roy has emphasized, far greater enforcement, so that if a company engages in corruption, if a company sells into a conflict that has either been embargoed or in which violations of international law or war crimes are taking place, there are legal consequences, not just for the company as a corporate entity, but also for the senior office holders of that company. As Marjolijn said quite correctly, this is unlike any other industry. And we very heavily regulate industries that have life or death consequences, like pharmaceuticals and health. There is no industry that has more immediate life or death consequences than the trade in weapons. And at the moment, if you do something wrong as a company, chances are you won't even get investigated. Therefore, the chances of you actually coming to court and suffering any sort of consequences are virtually non-existent. And if you are one of the unfortunate few to be investigated, you'll get a fine that you see as a cost of business. So I actually think the carrots are all there. I think what we need in relation to the producers are far more sticks.
That's one of the questions coming from the audience now. How can arms producers be accounted for in this proposal, given that they focus on profit by neglecting the morality of their deals, or at least they're allowed to? I don't know if Hannah or Alviina want to talk about how this would be strengthened in their proposal. Andrew says clearly it's necessary.
Well, I can take it up. There are two parts. One is, yes, indeed, we need the sticks. I said we have to talk about the other side of the coin, which was maybe a nicer way of putting it. But in the end, we need proper control, and we need to make sure that we have transparent data about actual exports so that people can have the chance to discuss it. As Andrew said, most people just don't know to which country their arms export, but we have introduced something else. And that's the idea of due diligence. We are discussing due diligence. So the responsibility of companies when it comes to social standards, when it comes to climate in the European Union, for many trade agreements now, but also for all the kinds of productions that happen in third countries. And I don't see why arms exporting companies, as being very tricky on human life, should be exempted from this due diligence idea. At the moment, when I discuss with arms companies, they tell me, but it's the politics that make this decision. So they wash their hands off. They even wash their hands off, well, if they are in charge for some diversion and corruption around it. But it's like politics made the decision, that's it. And I don't think we should accept that any longer. As much as we put someone who produces clothes into the role of doing a due diligence or seeing if that's socially responsible, what they do, I think arms exporters or arms companies just need to have the same responsibility. And that's where we deliberately bring them in, so they cannot just wash their hands off, which means at one point their CEOs or their decision makers can and may be taken to court. And that's how you really change the mindsets in the companies.
I'd like to bring Roy in here because, Hannah, when we looked at the results of your survey, when people are asked this direct question, do you want your country to deliver arms to a government that is violating human rights? Everybody says no. But we are not seeing public debate. Nobody marches in the streets about this. Remember the rallies against TTIP. I mean, or think about, the climate change. Obviously, when people are inspired or when they're horrified enough, they do go to the streets. They do make sure that this is in the public eye. We don't really see that with arms trade. And I've worked with you on these issues before, Hannah. Everybody involved in it is very passionate, but it's not widespread. How can we do more? How can we do more to raise awareness of this and then let people make their own decisions about whether they want to see their governments allowing these kind of trades to go forward? Roy?
I think you have struck on something which is an issue, is that the level of public engagement on this issue is not where it should be and where the opinion polling would suggest it might be. It's a tricky one to know how to change that. I mean, it depends on what's going on in the news at any time. And again, coming back to the Yemen war, for years that's been called the forgotten war. And then there was a period where it did gather more attention, which ironically wasn't so much about the war itself, but about the Khashoggi assassination, and that drew attention to the behavior of Saudi Arabia more broadly, but it highlighted attention on the Yemen war. And that's where you saw a significant change in the export policy from a number of EU states. So it does take those big kind of moments, I think, to capture public attention, and that's we can build on that. But if I may, just to add one more point on that due diligence argument, there are two additional points. This claim from industry that, well, if the government takes the decision, we ask them and they decide and they know better than we do. There's two aspects that might be forgotten there. One is that licenses have a time horizon. So you could get a license today and you could export under that license in a year's time. And a lot can change in that year. And it's completely illegitimate for a business to claim that a decision made by a government a year ago necessarily covers me for what happens today. The other side is that the business does not sit quietly and wait for the government to make decisions. Business lobbies government extensively and has far greater access to government than Saferworld or Shadow World Investigations has. And they are trying to set the frame within which the government decisions are taken. So I think this idea of due diligence on companies is critically important, and I certainly hope that this develops. And I think industry is getting a bit nervous that this may become an issue in the future.
So they push the envelope when it's in their interest and then hide behind it when they don't want to take responsibility for the end result here. Speaking of public engagement, let's do our share. Remind everybody to tweet about this event at #EUArms and to submit your questions here on the right. I have a question from Alexander Lurtz, thanking Hannah for bringing this to the public debate right now. And he wants to know, how do you overcome the resistance of France? In his words, the strongest supporter of a laissez-faire policy. We do know that it is one of the largest arms exporters in the EU, the largest in the EU. And so, Hannah, what are you going to do about France? And it's not the only one.
I was muted. France is a bit the elephant in the room. It may clearly not be the only one, but it's by far the biggest arms exporters of stuff going out of the EU. So if we find a way to engage with France, and especially if we have a French-German agreement on this issue, then I think we can really move ahead. How do we engage with France? And that's a bit the message behind it. It's the other side of the coin. France wants or pushes the European Union a lot when it comes to the European Defence Fund. It pushes the European Union a lot when it comes to procurement. It pushes the European a lot when it comes to buying European weapons by European Union member states. So France is the one pushing every time it comes to making the life easier for the arms industry, because they have this close link as well. And other member states, and I know other governments, are a bit more reluctant and a bit more cautious, also because of the export policy of France. And I think here we really need to have the carrot and the stick, or the two sides of the coin discussion. So we can engage in how to strengthen European defense, including French defense. But that has to come with proper arms export control and transparency. And given that we are starting this discussion now with the big defense summit under French presidency, I just hope, also based on our proposal, there will be a stronger push from some member states and from the civil society to make it a whole and a round package to really push European defense to the next level, and not just the side of making the life easier for the arms industry.
I'm going to now bring a question from Aurélie Boutert, who says that the Conseil d'État in France is still needs to rule on the case of exports to parties in the Yemeni conflict. If it fails to sanction French violations of the common position as it exists now, will the case for a regulation be stronger? I mean, will that be proof for you, Hannah, that the system is broken? And our other panelists as well, feel free to come in.
I have to admit, I don't need more proof to show that the system is broken. It's 100% clear that this system is broken, and the more we have these joint arms projects like the Eurofighter, where we'll have fights between EU member states over exports, the more we build on that proof. France is a case in point on how, if the public gets interested in the kind of actual exports happening, public opinion shifts. So once people know where exports actually end up and we have a discussion, we really have a push towards a stricter export control. I don't know how that ruling will end. I see Andrew raising his hand, so maybe he's going to step in. But especially France in the last 1 or 2 years has clearly shown how much of a push for a stronger export there can come in very unlikely contexts.
Andrew?
I think an important point to make here is certainly it would make the case for regulation stronger depending on that ruling. But I think, as Hannah is implying, we don't necessarily need that ruling to know what is going on. The reality of the situation, as we sit here talking about this today, is that innocent civilians are being killed in Yemen, and not as collateral damage to a conflict. Some of them are being intentionally targeted. Schools, hospitals, places of residence, etc., are actually being targeted using European-made weapons. And it's extremely important to bear in mind that these weapons, as we've heard through the subsidies, in some countries like France, state ownership, this is being done in the name of EU citizens using EU citizens' tax euros. And so the question becomes, as we've seen in that poll, do we actually want to be complicit in these war crimes? And I think, we talk about expanding the public debate. The only tiny silver lining of the tragic conflict in Yemen is that I think a lot of ordinary citizens in the European Union and elsewhere have woken up to some of the real consequences of the use of EU weapons. And it's like anything, Teri, one has to reach a tipping point. And I think we are pushing closer to that tipping point when it comes to the under-regulated use of European weapons in conflicts such as Yemen.
Roy, do you agree we are nearly at that tipping point now?
I've been doing this for a long time, and I keep on thinking, surely we're at a tipping point now, and we seem to struggle to get there. To be fair, progress has been made in various ways down the years in different respects. At one point, arms brokers were completely unregulated. That is now no longer the case. So progress has been made, but it's been hard fought. But you get to that point where you look at what has happened in Yemen. You look at the decisions that have been taken by some member states, compare those to the decisions that have been taken to others, and I kind of think, if it's not obvious now, when does it become obvious? Because this is a very extreme case, and it does show that the system is not working, and it clearly is not working in the way that it should. So I keep my fingers crossed that we're very close to the tipping point, but it's not necessarily, unfortunately. But
Marjolijn, just to give you a last remark here, because we unfortunately have to wrap up to the Q&A section here. Marjolijn, do you believe that because we are seeing, I mean, you didn't agree that the system is broken, but that it could have improvements. So finally, from you, are these proposals something that you believe that will be seriously considered?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm sure we'll seriously consider all good proposals on the table. Definitely. As I said out, there is always room for improvement. There's a great need for more convergence, and I think the Council agrees on that with the European Parliament. So definitely within the co-arm working group, we'll surely have a good look at these proposals. And as I said, also many of the ideas very much align with ideas that we're already currently working on and that we've already taken steps on. So I'd also like to invite everybody to really scrutinize our online database that is now searchable for the second year in a row, where the EU is by far the most transparent and accessible arms exporter.
That may be true, but the competition isn't fierce, Marjolijn, I'm afraid, in some categories here.
Why is that?
Okay. Thank you very much. Andrew, you had one last comment, and then I am going to give the show back to the ladies that started it here. Andrew, one final comment from you?
Thanks very much, Teri. I just wanted to make the point when it comes to talking about tipping points and progress on this issue. I had to leave my own country, South Africa, in the mid-1980s during apartheid because I was involved with the ANC, which was then illegal. If anyone had told me at that point that I would ever be allowed to go back to my own country, let alone that Nelson Mandela, within 9 to 10 years, would not just be out of jail, but would be president of a democratic South Africa, I would have probably offered them a straitjacket. So history does some extraordinary things to us, and it's our responsibility as active citizens to continue to push those in power for the sorts of changes that we've seen elsewhere. So I remain an enormous optimist.
Thank you. That was a point worth making. Now, thank you very much to the three of you, and thank you also to Alviina and Hannah and to your offices for providing me and everyone else the opportunity to talk about such an important issue here. I'm going to hand it back now to Alviina and Hannah.
Thank you all so much. For my side, the discussion has been very interesting, and we will get plenty of food for thought from this. And surely this is not the end of the debate, it's just the beginning. So we very much hope that we can take this discussion forward with all of you also in the future. And I very much thank you for your positive feedback on our proposal. And I also trust that we have a real opportunity here to actually change the EU's arms export regime for the better. Actually, we have launched also a campaign to get citizens more involved. And we also launched in the morning a postcard action, which I hope that everyone who is interested could join. Could somebody in our team post the link in the chat, perhaps Ishi? So basically, with this action, we ask people to send a postcard with our website to Ursula von der Leyen to urge her to inform more strict EU arms rules. And for all of the sent postcards by the people, we will deliver hard copies to the Commission on their behalf. So we will try to make it a visually effective kind of a campaign. And I hope you all can go and send your own postcard, but also share this link in your networks, with your colleagues, with your friends, and help us bring this call to the attention of President von der Leyen. And I think this will be one way to give this campaign a bit more participatory approach, which we would be happy about. Also, we would like to bring to the discussion the Conference of the Future of Europe, and I hope we could use that as a platform also to raise this idea. The events have been posted there, and main ideas from this debate will also be updated to a platform to enforce the arms exports regime. And we kindly ask you to go and endorse these ideas in order for them to be included in the COFE results. And we actually have already had a meeting with civil society organizations. It was a very big meeting. A lot of people were interested. And I hope that these NGOs will also have their own meetings and events to address the arms export and enhance our messages. And of course, thank you also for registering for our newsletter to keep involved and updated. You can also register for it in the Greens EFA website. I wish to thank Teri for all your great work in facilitating this discussion. Also, thank you, Andrew, Roy, and Marjolijn for giving us their views. And it has been very, very impressive and interesting for us for food of thought. And of course, Hannah, my dear colleague, and whole our team for organizing this event. We very much look forward to continuing discussion in the following months. And although I know this is a difficult task to do, I'm sure that we can make this happen and can make EU actually work for peace rather than selling arms to those hands that they would definitely not be the right address. So thank you all, and I give the floor to Hannah to also give her remarks.
Thank you, Alviina. And I'm not going to have much to add because I think it was a super fruitful discussion. Just 2 points regarding the tipping point. I think on the factual side, we have 2 aspects that push us much closer on the tipping point, which is the European Defence Fund, where also Marjolijn said it kind of forces the European Union to get involved in the issue of what do we do with arms, with weapons that are produced in this fund in terms of export decision. But it's also the big new arms project like the Future Combat Air System. And we are having the same for battle tanks and for battleships, where really different member states work together, and the whole issue of arms export can stop these joint EU productions if they are not solved quite soon. So that's the factual aspect that will put us towards the tipping point. The other aspect, and here I'm very happy for all remarks my colleague Alviina made, is public involvement, public pressure. And here we really hope to have you on our side and to continue this discussion on how we can make our proposal and the EU arms exports, well, better, stricter, more transparent, but also in pushing the Commission to really pick this up, because we cannot just discuss improvements for European defense. We also need to discuss how to make it more responsible, and to become as EU a more responsible actor in this world in chaos. On that note, I wish you a good Tuesday. I wish you a good week. And rest assured, we will keep on pushing as the Greens in the European Parliament, and we have many allies in the member states. Thank you very much.